next week resume the normal time again. No, next week is no bank holiday apparently. Yeah, but that's after Shavuos, I think. No. Yeah. Okay, so where we're up to is no. Wait, it's day after Shavuos. So Monday after Shavuos, 2 days after Shavuos. Lamed Zayin with base. Lamed Zayin with base. We're up to the new sugya. Amari Nahar Doi. This is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines up from the end of the Amud on Lamed Zayin with base. Amari Nahar Doi. So Nahar Doi say Achlon Ritzufin Eino Chazaka. What does it mean Achlon Ritzufin? So it means that, remember we were talking in the previous sugya about trees being planted. And you're supposed to have, basically the normal way to plant trees is 10 trees in a base saw. The area that's a base saw, you have 10 trees, right? And we said that if you have trees that are planted, 10 in each base saw, and you consume, you consume each year, you use the fruit of, let's say only 10, let's say there's 30 trees across 3 base saw, and the trees are all over, scattered around. There are 10 trees amongst the 3 base saw that produce fruit. You remember this? They produce fruit each year, and you use the fruit of all of those trees. Each year of the 3 years, right? Each year of the 3 years, right? The din is that's called the chazaka, because I've done everything I need to do, at least according to Rabbi Shmuel, anyway, right? I've done everything I need to do for each year, so it's a good enough chazaka. But we said that you can this only really works because the trees have to be planted normally, right? They have to be planted normally. You can't crowd in too many trees into a smaller area, because then basically there's no point. You might as well get rid of the trees. Your trees are going to be uprooted. They're not going to last. They're not going to stay there. And that's what Nahar is going on. If you consume the trees and they're planted in ritzufin, which means that they're very close together. Let's say you got 15 trees in a base saw. That's not chazaka. Okay? And even if you eat all the trees, you eat the fruit of all the trees all 3 years, it's no chazaka, because you cannot establish chazaka in a situation where the trees are going to be removed. It's too crowded. They can't survive. There's too many trees. And in a situation where they're not going to last, they're going to be uprooted, you can't establish chazaka. That's what Nahar is saying. Because by definition, they're not going to stay there. Maski for Rav asked the question on this. If so, I mishrad aspasta, but my konilo. Aspasta is a type of vegetable, and a mishra is like a patch of this vegetable patch. And they used to crowd these. They're always planted very closely together. How can you acquire it? You can never acquire it. You can never form a chazaka, because it's always very crowded. That's the nature of how they're planted. That's the Rashbam. The Rashbam says that really, the Rashbam will see has 2 explanations of this Gemora. According to the first explanation of Rashbam, he says, what's Rava's question? Because obviously, if it's the norm to be planted that way, like crowded vegetable patch, then obviously you can make a chazaka because they're planted normally. So he says it wasn't a really strong question, but Rava didn't like Nahar Doi's approach, and therefore he just asked a sort of light question, even though it wasn't a really strong question, because he wanted to get to his own opinion. He wanted to disagree with them. In other words, it's not because of the question that he disagreed with Nahar Doi. He disagreed with Nahar Doi, and he posed it as a question to them, even though the question wasn't very strong, right? Effectively. Ela Omar Rava says that he says, if you want to say something about being crowded close together, then you should say the following then. Mochron ritzufin eino chazaka. Eino karka, sorry. Mochron ritzufin eino karka. If you sell them crowded together, ein lo karka. Yeah, that means to say, let's say if you sell trees very crowded closely together, let's say more than 10 to a base saw, then the din is you don't follow the rule of someone who acquires 3 trees always acquires the land. We learned this last time. Remember, we said if you buy 3 trees from someone, if I sell Jeremy 3 trees, he gets the land between the trees and around, like enough space for the trees to be worked, for the worker to pick the fruit and that type of stuff. Well, that does not work if the trees are too crowded, because if they're too crowded together, they're going to be uprooted. So if you sell crowded trees, you don't get land. That is the din, says Rava, where it's relevant, this being planted too close together. Okay? And the Gemara is going to go on to say that in fact we can say that this is a machlokas tanoim. We can suggest it's actually a machlokas tanoim, this din of Rava. But let's see the Rashbam before we do that. The Rashbam is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down where it gets wide. Not where it gets very wide, but where it gets medium-sized wide. Ochlon Ritzufin, right? You got it? Ochlon Ritzufin. When he consumes them close together, that means the honey shloshim milonos, these 30 trees, could go in, for example, shenatuin tesvov b'veisor. They're planted 15 trees in a beisor. Now that's more than fits there. Eina chazaka is not chazaka. Afilu ochron kulon kol shalosh shonim. And even if he consumes all of them, all 3 years, that means he eats the fruit all 3 years. It's not a chazaka. Why? Because he hasn't performed the chazaka as people keep it like there in that way. You uproot them and remove them. Ask the question is, if this is the case, since because they're planted close together, it's not called it can't establish chazaka. If that's the case, Chaim Mishra is an aruga, the aspasta, a patch of aspasta. But my konila, how can you acquire it? Hare zuzrua ritzufa. It's planted too close together. And even so, and we said at the beginning of the parak, the Havi Chazaka, you can establish Chazaka with a patch of aspasta. Now, the Rashbam says, it's not a great question. Because this one is the norm to be planted like that. This one is not the norm. This one weakens the land a lot. That means the trees weaken the land a lot, and therefore you can't plant them close together. And the vegetables, they don't weaken the land. So it's not really a great question. It's just that Rava did not agree with Nahartoi of a milsa ba'alma the Merkilul Nahartoi, and therefore he just said sort of something to push them away because he wanted to give his own view, right? Now, obviously, that's not kind of a great way of learning the Gemora, because normally setup of the Gemora is someone presents an opinion, someone else asks a cracking question, and then presents his own opinion. Now, this is not really, if it's not a cracking question, then there's not really a reason to dispute the opinion. And therefore, the Rashbam gives us another approach. Yesh Lefarish, he says, it's possible to explain the Gemara in a different way. Ochlon Ritzufin, Eina Chazaka. If you consume the fruit in a crowded field like this, Eina Chazaka, it's not Chazaka. Shesofan Ashari Shosai, because at the end you're going to uproot it, and at a later stage of their growth, you're actually going to uproot the trees and scatter them, the plantings, the saplings. Shekain derech ilonos, because that's the way of trees. He says the norm with trees is to plant a lot at the beginning. And after they grow, you scatter them. Therefore, it's not a chazaka. Because they are destined to be uprooted, right? Because they're destined to be uprooted, right? That's what happens. After they grow, they're scattered. Just because they're destined to be uprooted like the aspasta? No, because that's a good question. That's a good question. That means if you want to establish chazaka at that stage, it sounds like it doesn't work. That's not the primary way they grow. And he brings a proof. The proof is when it comes to saplings, we find the norm is to plant 10 in a base saw. But with trees, with fully grown trees, only 3 for a base saw. They were saplings originally for you yudla base saw, and then they were 10. How did they get from 10 to 3? Right? It must be that they were saplings originally, and they were planted 10 in a field. And subsequently, you reduce them to 3 in a base saw, because once they grew to too large, then you uproot them. Presumably, you take the trees elsewhere. You don't have to waste them. You take, it's a bit like, they'll sell the little saplings somewhere, or they'll move them to another field. So you start off with a field of 10 saplings, but when they get too big, you're going to uproot. You're going to remove some of them.
It's advantageous for them to be initially planted together. In other words, why do you have to go to all the trouble of starting with the saplings in a dense area, then taking some of them out and putting it? Why don't you just stop them in?
Well, it could be you'll sell them. It could be you're maximizing the use of the land at the beginning. You can see a number of reasons why a person would would do that, and then sell the young saplings to someone else. But the point we're saying is that because you're going to remove them, okay, therefore, if you use the fruit when they're at that early stage of development, and you're using it at that stage, you can't establish chazaka. What we're saying. You have to be using them at a normal stage of growth.
Yeah, because you're not getting any growth out. You're not getting any fruit out.
Well, that's an interesting question. Maybe you're not. Maybe it means, yeah.
Actually, they're not acting as trees, if you like, producing fruit. They're just a commodity that you're growing up in order to sell or to then develop as full-grown trees.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, therefore, according to this explanation as well, is how can we understand the whole Gemara beforehand, which seemed to say that you consume trees, although we did say that was scattered across all three base saw. But even so, it's a bit difficult to understand the previous Gemara, where there were 10 in each, and it seems to say you could establish chazaka. Maybe that's what he's saying, maybe because they're in one place. Because they're in one place, therefore, that's not called a chazaka if you're all consuming them all in one place, in one base saw, because you're going to remove them. By the way, Rava's question on this, according to this explanation, Rava's question is much easier to understand. Says the Rashba, "Mechein derech aspasta kamo kain." This is the norm with aspasta as well. L'zara harbe b'yachad ritzufin, kamo she'osin ekrishin akruv. You sow a huge amount together, all mixed up together, like is the case with leeks and cabbage. It's all the same thing. That's what you do. You plant a lot together, and then you uproot them. And I think he means you uproot them all. And you fill a large patch with them once they get too big. Okay, it's like starting in a little greenhouse, and once they've grown, you remove them and take them into a big area. And that's what Rava asks. This is the case. This mishra das pasta, the patch of an aspasta, you can never acquire it. This seems to me to be the explanation. Because since the aspasta, it's one thing with the trees. With the trees, we're not saying that you can't acquire or you can't establish chazaka when they are planted 10 to a base saw. You can, but it means that you can't establish chazaka if you consume them or use the fruit or whatever they produce in that way, whilst all 10 of them, whilst they're in that early stage of growth. But presumably you can still establish chazaka, as we said in the previous sugya, where you have, let's say, we said you were using 3 from one field, 3 from another, 4 from another, and we said it was scattered across all 3 bases. So you can establish chazaka. There is a method of doing it. But with the aspasta, there's no way of doing it, because you're going to uproot the whole lot, the whole patch, I think that's what he's saying. You're going to uproot the whole lot. So there's no way of establishing chazaka. And therefore, if that is the case, Rava's question is very good. Because Rava's question on Doi is, if it's true what you're saying, you're ruling out being able to establish chazaka with the whole lot of crops, which doesn't make sense. And therefore he says, says the Rashbam carries on, if we're going to say anything about being crowded together, this is what we're going to say. So again, there's nothing to do, Rav has nothing to do with Nardah. He disagrees with Nardah and he says, I'm going to give you something totally different. You've got to be clear. It's not machlokus. It's not machlokus about the same point. Rav goes in a totally different direction. Do you understand? He says, if you want to know some halacha about being planted close together, I'll tell you this halacha, right? Not like Nardah, a different halacha. What is the halacha? If you sell trees too close together, ain't lo karka. You don't get land. Why? For example, there's more than 10 trees in a base saw. In this case, we don't say someone who buys 3 trees acquires the land, because this is not a field of trees, because it's destined to be uprooted, to be removed. That's what's going to happen. And therefore, you don't get any land. You don't get any land. That's what Rava's din is. Now, let's go back to the Gemora. Is that clear? Yeah, is that clear? Now, the Gemora says, yeah, is that right? Now, Reb Zera says, this din of Rava actually seems to be a machlokas tanoi. And it's a machlokas tanoi in a Mishnah in Kilayim. The Mishnah in Kilayim says, Kerem shunotua al pochos me'arba amos. You have a vineyard which is planted less than 4 amos. That means to say, there's less than 4 amos between each row in the vineyard. The vineyards are planted in rows, very close rows together. How do we know that from the Chumash? Oh, very good, Jeremy. On the ball. Fantastic. What does it say with Bilam?
He went on the donkey.
Went on the donkey. What does it say?
Vines either side.
Yeah, well, it uses the phrase "Vayamod Malach Hashem b'mishoil hakromim," right, which is the path of the vineyards. So he stood in the path of the vineyards, and there's Goder Mizeh, Goder Mizeh. Okay, that's the kind of there was a fence on either side, but the implication seems to be that there are paths now in vineyards because they've planted very straight lines. Yeah, Mishol hakromim. Now the point is that there's obviously going to be a norm for how much space you need between your vines, right? And the Mishnah says if you plant your vine and there's less than 4 amos between the rows, let's say there's only 3 amos. So Rabbi Shimon Omer Eino Kerem. Rabbi Shimon says it's not a vineyard. It's not a vineyard. What does it mean it's not a vineyard? Well, that's got relevance to halachas like kilayim. Because if it's called a vineyard, so Hashem vineyard, then there are specific halachas of how close you can bring other crops because of forbidden mixtures because of kilayim, right? Yes? So Rabbi Shimon says, if it's too close together, it's not got a din of a vineyard. It's a bit counterintuitive because you've got more grapes. But the halacha is that certain halachas only apply if you've got an established vineyard, right? Established Shem Keri. Now that's Rabbi Shimon's view. The Chachomim say, sure, it's a vineyard. You just look at the middle vine, the middle row of vines, if it doesn't exist. Imagine the middle vine. Imagine the middle row is not there. Let's say you've got a row here, and a row there, and a row there. 3 rows, 1, 2, 3, and there are 3 amos between each row. Okay, and that's too small. That's too crowded. It's not. That's not healthy for the vines. Okay, the Chacham say that doesn't make it not a vineyard. Just imagine the middle row isn't there, and you've got a nice row there of vines, a nice row there. So therefore, it's called a vineyard, right? That's what the Chacham say. So therefore, that's what we're saying. It's a machlokas. It's a machlokas Tanoi. Let's see the Rashbam explains this. Al pochas medal amos she'ein bein shor l'shor la'gimel amos. There's only 3 amos between each row. Eino kerem. It's not a vineyard. Maybe zera l'sham. Someone who brings plants things there, seeds. Eino loki doesn't get malchus mishum le'sizra karmachal kilayim because the din you're not allowed to plant your vineyard with forbidden mixtures. And you're actually allowed to eat it as well. You're allowed to eat the crops. Obviously, there'll be halachas about this, but that's the idea. You can imagine the middle row, says the Chachomim, the line between the other 2 rows, look at it as if it doesn't exist. You've got 6 amos now between the first and the third rows. Now, how has this got to do with our Gemora? Because our Gemora as well, which we talked about selling them close together. The Rabbanon, according to Rabbanon, you look at the middle rows as if they don't exist. The dinon kimufuzorim. And it's as if they are scattered. They're not close together. And therefore, if you sell them too close together, you will get land. Because the Chachomim say, just because it's too close together, you can just discount the middle row, just ignore it, and therefore it's normal. It's just got something in the way. So just ignore what's in the way, and you still got. You are ignoring what's actually there. But the point is that it doesn't prevent you having being called a field or being called a vineyard. Again, if I sell something to someone else, a minimal number of trees, let's say 3 trees, it's like I'm selling you a field, right? It's like I'm selling you a field. I'm selling you a minimal number of vineyards. I'm selling there are 3 vines or whatever. I'm selling you 3 vines, and as a result, you get land. That's halach. So the Chacham say, just because there's extra trees, right, that doesn't prevent it being called a vineyard. It doesn't prevent it being called a field. Even though you've got extra trees, but it's not saying because they're extra trees, they don't detract from the good trees. That's the Chacham's view. It's a bit tricky to get your head around, but the point is that just what's overcrowded? You've overcrowded your field. Okay, fine. You overcrowded your field, right? But just because you overcrowded your field and there's too many crops there, that doesn't mean that you can't imagine they're not there and say, well, I've got a substantive minimal number of trees, which entitles it to be called a field. And therefore, the halachas of a field apply, which means if you sell it, you get land. If you want to plant other crops there, you've got a problem of kilai. The halachas apply. That's the point. It's still called a field. Rabbi Shimon ain't lo karka. But Shimon, you get no land. And this is the machlokes Tanoim. The most of the Rava Tanoi, the machlokes of Rava, the statement of Rava is a machlokes Tanoi. Rabbi Shimon, it's Tanoi, meaning Rava's only going like Rabbi Shimon. Or Delok Rabbana, not like the Rabbana. Because Rava's opinion is that the very fact that it's too crowded means it's not a field. You don't get land, right? It's like it's not a vineyard, right? That's like Rabbi Shimon. Or Delok Rabbana, not like Rabbana. In Bava Basra later on in this Masechta, it explains how far away they need to be, more than 4 amos, and it's still called the keren. In other words, if the vines are too far away, that also means it's not a vineyard. Right? So that's explained later on. So all we're saying is basically that Rava's din. If I sell you land, right? If I sell you 3 trees, and the halacha is that you don't get land. You do get land normally, but you don't if they're too crowded together. That din only fits according to Rabbi Shimon. It only fits according to Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon says things that are too crowded together are not called a field, they're not called a vineyard, not called a field, and therefore you don't get, because they're going to be uprooted, they're going to be removed, and therefore as a result you don't have you don't get any land. Whereas according to Rabbanon you will, because the Rabbanon say that it's true this field is crowded, but it's still called a field because for example, the Rabbanon might say, okay, you're going to uproot it. What are you going to uproot? Maybe you'll uproot the middle row. A field is a field. Yeah, exactly. Omri Naradoi, 2 lines from the bottom of the onwards. Haiman dezovin dikla lechavre, someone who sells a palm tree to his friend. Konile, he acquires it, mishipule ad tahomo. And this is a very, very interesting din. We've learned that in order to acquire land, you need to sell a minimal number of trees. 3 trees means you get land. But Naradoi comes up with something very fascinating. If I sell you a palm tree, you acquire from the base of the palm tree, shipule means the bottom of the palm tree, ad tahoma. What does that mean? The tahoma. That's so straight down. Underneath the tree, you acquire all of the land directly underneath the tree. Now that's got a lot of practical ramifications. Number one. No, he says, he does. That's interesting. Doesn't seem to be talking about the roots.
It's just a trunk.
Seems directly under the trunk. And there's 2 practical ramifications of that.
Where the tree is.
No, I don't think so. It seems to be underneath the trunk, but there's 2 practical ramifications of that. Number one, it means that you are allowed to replant a tree. If it dies, you can replant it because I've bought the land directly underneath. Number two, let's say the government approaches the owner of the land and says, we want to build a high-speed rail link, HS2, underneath your land. Now, because he had sold the tree to Farmer Giles down the road. Do you understand? You've got a piece of land, and in that land are growing trees. But you sold one of your trees to the farmer down the road, and they're going to pay you a lot of money to give permission to dig this high-speed rail link underneath your land. You can't give permission. You have to ask permission from the farmer. You're not allowed to dig a tunnel underneath that tree. Anywhere else is fine, but underneath that tree, directly under that tree, doesn't matter how deep it is, how deep the tunnel is, and they say to you, but the tunnel's not going to affect the tree. I'm telling you, it's so deep, it doesn't matter. Because he owns the land, according to Adoi, directly underneath the tree. He owns it right up to however far you can go. Pardon? Yeah, according to Naruto. So it's got a number of practical ramifications. Let's see the last Rashbam on the page before we get to the question on it. Mishipula, Konile, so there's 2. Konile lekech lekarka. The buyer acquires the land. Mishipula ad tahoma shulov. The bottom, matagmina shipuloi. So it means underneath. Kloma kola karka. It means that he acquires all the land, mishule ho'elon, from the bottom of the tree, dainu svasa karka, that means the edge of the ground, that's the bottom of the tree, ad tahum shel karka, to the depths of the land, sha'afal pi, even though shadakir echidihu, it's a singular palm tree, it's not, in the Mishnah says, even 2 trees you don't get land. This is around the tree you don't get anything. with 3 trees, you get beinein, between them, and outside of them, of a sala, enough for the worker in his basket. But directly underneath the tree, say Nahardoi, you do get land. The kivon de ilon the peros of koina, sky mekarkazu, gamim yomasa ilon yitachavim koimai. Since he the tree he acquires it for its fruit, right? To live and grow from this land. Therefore, gamim yomas for ilon yitachavim koimai. Right? Even if the tree dies, right, you'll be able to plant another one in its place. Okay. That means that's the outcome of the fact that you acquire the tree for its fruit to live off this land. So you can, even if it dies, you can replant. Bashmin and Nami, we also learn which I said before, but the owner of the field is not allowed to dig underneath the land even more than 1,000 amos. Truth is, it wasn't a good example I gave really about the government, because that might have followed different rules. There's a concept of derech hamelech. There's like a government has certain rights to be able to commandeer land, compulsory purchase. Yeah.
Well, I've got a case for they offer £50 for underneath the land for the tunnels.
That's all they offer.
Well, there is, because no one is so far down.
It's a bit nevuch.
Well, it's not having any impact.
And you can't object.
No, it's compulsory purchase on what you've got no ground.
You mean what are they digging underneath your land?
It's not mine, but
No, what are they digging underneath the land?
building a tunnel. Well, if they ever build it, but yeah, building a tunnel.
What sort of tunnel?
Near Regent's Park.
What sort of tunnel? Was it like
It's HS2.
oh, HS2. Oh, you were involved in that?
Well, I've got a client with land.
A client with land,
It's
isn't it?
nothing's not an issue.
And they gave £50.
You have to standard thing because if there's no, you do have ownership of that.
So deep, so deep. Yeah.
You do. I'm not a lawyer, but you do have ownership, but you've got no benefit. It's got no value.
Yeah.
It's so far down, you can't.
Interesting.
You know, it's the width of a tunnel. It's going exactly out of car.
All right.
So
Fascinating.
that's it. But yeah, it's like Derek Hamelech would be.
Yeah. So the government has certain rights to be able to force you, basically. Yeah. But the Rava has a different problem with that. Maskil Rava, top of the next song, Rava says, following question, but Lemole, why does he acquire the land? Let the seller say, Kurkumo de Rishka Zaviniloch. I sold you a saffron tree. They used the saffron, the Gemora used the saffron as an example, because saffron was a tree where basically you used to sell it, they used to sell this tree in the ground, and you leave it until the fruit is finished growing, and then basically you uproot the tree as well. And you uproot the tree. That was the norm of the saffron tree. You sell the tree and it grows as long as it grows, and then when it's finished growing, when it's finished producing fruit, you remove the tree, right? So why can't he say to him, I sold you a kurkuma de rishka, akar kurkuma de rishka, so uproot the saffron tree and get lost. Yeah. Who says he gets the mechatesi? Who says that he gets the land underneath, right? So let's see Rashba. Maskil or Rava, my konakarka, top of the omelet. Why does Rava ask the question? Why does he own the land, the keneged ilan, underneath the tree? Since it says in the Mishnah, lo konakarka, he doesn't acquire land. Klal lo kona, he doesn't acquire any land. And that which you asked, the kimdeles Chaim b'karka zu kanoi, since he acquired it. He acquired the land to live on this land. Given the sky and acquired it to live on this land. So the argument Nardoi were making was that he therefore acquires the the nourishment from the land. Also to plant another one in the place of this tree. After it dries out, or it's chopped down. You have to understand what Shlomo is trying to do. Now, there's a lomdus in what Nahardoi is saying. Okay, Nahardoi are looking at it like this: you sell someone else a tree. You can't only sell them the tree, because then they have to leave immediately. You understand?
Well, I've got to leave immediately.
Because if I sell you just a tree and the land has got no relevance to your tree,
you've got no rights in the tree. You've got the support.
A tree cannot exist without something in the land. You understand? Exactly. So now Hardoi's argument is, take that to a logical step further, which is, if you're selling me a tree, what are you really doing? You're selling me a tree, to grow off land. And if that's the case, then Hardoi, well, that means you actually own the land. And if you own the land, you should be able to plant another tree there. And Rava's question is, no, let me split the two. I can understand that you've sold me a tree to live off the land, but that's not the same as acquiring land to replant another one when the tree dies. Exactly. And the proof is the way they used to sell the saffron trees. Yeah. Let the seller say, Kruk Oriental, which is the saffron tree, Oriental. V'regilim lemochro bekarka, and they used to sell it in the land. V'manichoi ad sheyigma period, and they used to leave it until it finished the flowering or fruit. V'oikrin uprooted it. Afoilan shemachati lach leperisov. So too the tree which I sold you for its fruit. I never sold you the land. I was just allowing you to leave your tree in my land as long as it needs the land. Until it dries out. That's similar to the saffron. And once it dries out, the land will not benefit it anymore. Right? Once it dries out, that's it. The land is not going to give it any more benefit. Just like after the saffron has ripened and it's finished growing and it's finished the fruit, they say, okay, now remove it. There's no right. There's no right to replant a saffron in the same place. Also you shouldn't be allowed to plant another tree in its place. So Rava disputes Nahardoi, and he says there's no reason why the seller can't say to the buyer, right? There's no reason why the seller can't say to the buyer that your logic doesn't make sense. I sold you a tree. I sold you a tree, and that means I've sold you the tree. Yes, it's true that you're allowed to use the tree while it's growing from the land, but that doesn't mean that you can then plant a new one, right? I never sold you the land to plant a new one when it dies. Right? Rather, Rava says we have to say that, when the situation is that he's going to acquire land, it's babo machmas taina, when he comes with a claim. Rava says here he acquires the land underneath a tree, babo machmas hataino, when he comes with a claim. What's the claim? Shatoyin, he argues, he claims to the seller, he says, you explicitly sold me a tree and the land underneath to plant something else in its place. That's totally different. Ubishtar, he says, and there was a document that proves this. So where's the document? Where's the document? Where's the document? You got a star. Where's the star? The answer is 3 years. I've now used it for 3 years. Of course, I didn't keep my document more than 3 years. People don't keep documents more than 3 years, as we've learned many times. And now it's not comparable to the saffron tree. So Rava says that where will you have a valid claim to the land? When will a buyer have a valid claim to the land underneath the tree, to the extent that he should be allowed to what? To replant another tree when the first one died. If he claims that was the sale, that was the deal we made. You explicitly said you were selling me the land under the tree to replant another one in its place. You're telling me, prove it, right? The seller's going to say, prove it. I'm disagreeing with you, prove it. And he says, I don't have any documents, and I've got 3 years chazaka, so you can't disagree with me.
Sorry, the default position is that you don't.
Yeah, default, exactly. The default position is that if you just sell the tree, sell a tree.
So it's on the seller to specify that the land is.
Yeah.
Sorry, so it's on the buyer to insist that a contract.
Exactly.
Explicitly says that
exactly. Here there was no and he says there was a contract, but I haven't kept it for 3 years.
I'm giving you extra rights to what you would otherwise.
Yeah, this is a problem. There's an obvious problem with this. What's the problem? Yeah, exactly. Everyone's going to say that. You understand? After every chazaka, I'm going to say that. Whenever there's a chazaka on trees, I'm obviously going to say that, aren't I? What's to stop me, except being honest, right? Saying that, yeah, you sold me trees, but you also sold me the right to. Exactly. It's Chazaka doesn't prove it, but also
doesn't give you the right to.
let's say, okay, let's put it on the reverse. You look at the Gemara's question. It's just saying the Gemara. It's the Gemara's question. Amalei Mar Kashisha, brother of Chisda Rav Ashi. Mar Kashisha, the son of Rav Chisda, said to Rav Ashi that if this is true, then Ve'ila Korkama the risk if he did do a saffron type arrangement, he sold him just the tree. My Havalele Me'avad. What could he do? What can a seller do to ever prove it? Because once you get to 3 years, the guy is just going to say, the buyer's going to say, no, you sold me the land to plant something else. And I'm not going to be able to disprove that. Right? Says the Rashbam. Since someone who acquires a singular palm tree, he's believed with this claim, the and he's allowed to plant another tree in its place. Right? If he sold him a saffron tree, that means to say, if he sold him just a palm tree for its fruit, that's all he said, that's all he sold him. And he didn't specify any land. The Kaimelon that we hold in that case, ein lo karka, he doesn't get any land. To the extent that if it dries out or it's uprooted, lo the halacha is he's not allowed to plant anything else in its place. Right? That's the din. If he just sold him the palm tree for its fruit, if that's the case, my havalei lemoichel lemevad, right? What should the seller do? Shelo yehezeh bo machmas taina, right? V'shelo yehezeh bo machmas taina, that this one can't come with a claim, the buyer, and plant something else in its place. The kolodom yito nachas shalosh shonim. Because every person is going to claim after 3 years, Shapirish lo karka, that he specified land. This is going to be believed with his claim. So, you understand? If I'm a seller and I sell just the tree, there is no protection after 3 years for me. That's the problem. I've got no protection. If I sell just the tree, and that was genuinely the case, right? By the way, Tosus says, why a saffron tree? If you look at the second Tosus, very briefly, right? The kurkuma derishka, the kach nokat kurkuma derishka. This is why it says kurkuma derishka, shemiskayim bekarka gimel shonim, because it lasts 3 years in the land. That's how long the saffron tree grows for. That's the years of chazaka. And they used to leave it in the land as long as it survives. And it survived for 3 years. That was a saffron tree. That's why the Gemora used the saffron tree as an example. So a saffron tree is normally the growth cycle or whatever. It lasts, it lasts for 3 years, then it dies. Okay. So imagine Ruvain sells Shimon a saffron tree. And all he does is sells the tree. And that's the norm. Like we said, the default position is I'm just selling the tree. I'm not selling any land. Okay. That was Rava's whole argument, right? But the problem Mark Shisha asks on Rava is, Rava agrees that the lokeach, the buyer, after 3 years, can claim, make a valid taina, and say, no, you specified that I also would have ownership rights over the land to plant something else in its place after 3 years, or when it dies. But the Gemora asks, Mark Shisha asks, if that's true, there is no protection in place for the seller. Because if the seller ever just sold a saffron tree, just the tree, how's he ever going to be able to prove it? Who's got the document? Who's got the shtar to prove it? They didn't do things in triplicate. Who's got the shtar? The buyer. The buyer always gets the shtar, right? I give you, that's why proof of purchase. Yeah, proof of purchase. After 3 years, you don't keep your documents anymore. You shredded it. Well, you didn't look after it, right?
Well,
there's none of these 7 years. There's none of these 7 years of bank statements or whatever it is.
Unless it goes back to the Rabbi Akiva Ayin Tov and Ayin Ra. In other words,
Right.
Because you selling these?
Right, yes. Yeah.
In other words, it's the norm. It's the norm.
Right, that's a good point. But I think the Ayin Tov and Ayin Ra, is really quite specific, where there is a question over the scope of the sale.
Well, that's exactly what this is, isn't it?
Yeah, but not quite, because here it's the other way around. Here, the norm and the default is I just sold the tree.
Correct.
Nothing to do with nine yofa now. I just sold the tree. I sold your tree. I just sold the tree. I didn't sell the land. But the point is that if the buyer, after 3 years, would be believed to say that you also sold me the land, then that's something the seller can never disprove.
Well, except that you say, well, hang on, why on earth would I sell you land? Because the saffron tree we know grows after 3 years, it dies, and that's the end of it. And that's what I sold. That is how to default. That is the market value of a saffron tree. 3 years.
That's all fair and true, but Rover's argument is that just like a buyer, there's a protection in place for a buyer after 3 years, as we've learned throughout this parak, that he doesn't hold his documents, and therefore chazaka is good enough to prove ownership. So therefore chazaka is also good enough to prove ownership to the extent of owning the land as well underneath. I can have a taina, I can claim that was the case, and I'll be believed. And that obviously doesn't make sense. Yeah, that's right. I bought it from you. And what did I buy from you? That's the time. But again, it's a chazaka sheish taina. My chazaka is I've been using the land for 3 years, and I claim that you sold it to me. I also claim that you sold me the land underneath. I understand what you're saying. That this is that he should be able to rejoin and say who says.
No, nobody sells land.
But sometimes it seems that they do.
They need to be very specific.
So the Gemara answers though there is a solution. The solution is he should have objected.
To what?
Look at Rashbam, right? Just before it gets wide. Within every 3 years, loidia to inform, to make known, he was only selling, he wasn't selling land, the sale was a saffron tree type sale. And then he's not going to be able to claim after 3 years, I had a document, it was lost. Since he objected, he should have been careful with his document, as we've learned the whole way through the parak. So in other words, the protection exists for the seller, because all the seller has to do is object once in the 3 years, and say, I'm now putting you on notice. I'm informing you, and remember, he doesn't even just say it in front of him. It just has to be a rumor that can carry to him. I'm putting you on notice that I only sold you the tree and not the land at all. That's not such a big deal for the seller to do. You don't like anything, Jojo?
Well, except the seller, say what you like. So
the buyer can say that. Yeah, but he's not going to be believed now, because since I've objected, since I've made a machor, I'm going to have to actually have keep hold of my shtar. Says the Gemora, and I'll prove it to you. Says the Gemara, that's good enough to make an objection. Because if you don't say this, hani mashkanto de surah, this mashkanto of surah. Now we've come across a mashkanto de surah before. A mashkanto de surah is basically if I lend you money, and I'm a bit worried you might not pay me back. So we have an arrangement called the mashkanto de surah. Mashkanta is like a deposit or a guarantee. It means you give me land, and I'm allowed to use the land and thereby pay off the loan, pay off the debt. Understand? I lend Jeremy, let's say I lend Jeremy £100,000, for example, and I'm a bit worried whether he's going to pay me back. So what? Yeah. So Jeremy says he's got a field in Buckinghamshire, and it's a great field, and it produces beautiful apples. So he says to me, okay, 10 years, you're going to use the field. And that means over 10 years, you're going to do really well. Your apples are going to be amazing. You're going to make incredible cider with the apples and sell it. And that will gradually repay the loan. That's called the mashkanta de surah. What's the problem with the mashkanta de surah? What am I doing for 10 years? I'm using Jeremy's land. I'm working the land normally. I've got my I've got my harvester. I'm harvesting the apples. I'm selling them. I'm doing everything with the land. So what am I going to say to Jeremy after 10 years? I'm going to say it's mine. And how's he going to prove it's not? I don't keep documents more than 3 years. So therefore, it's only mashkanta, which means, you understand, really it's only mashkanta, which means really I should be giving the land back after 10 years, once the loan has been repaid through my use.
Does the borrower have the money being positive?
Does it make a difference? Even if it does. So what? Everyone knows you lent your money. That's right. But I'm going to say there's nothing to do with it. I'm going to say there's nothing to do with it. Yes, it's true. I might have lent you money 10 years ago, but this field you sold to me. Prove it wasn't sold. A sale.
There were no repayments.
Okay, fine. So it was no repayment. So you still owe me money as well. So the Rashban, so Gemora says, if you're not going to say this, Hani Mashkanta de Surah, this Mashkanta de Surah, the Kosa Bahachi, in which is written, and they used to write this in the document, at the end of these years, this land should go back without money because that's the repayment. Yeah. In other words, there's no more money I can claim because the loan has been repaid through my usage of the land. Yeah. So there's a fundamental flaw in the whole arrangement. Because if he hides the documents of mashkanta, he could just hide it, the shtar of mashkanta, the shtar which details this arrangement, which is I've lent you money and I'm going to have the field is going to be the way I get repaid. He says, I bought it. He's also going to be believed. He can just claim it's mine. I've got no shtar. All right. And if that's this is more of a chitema, and if you're going to say hochinami, okay, maybe that's true. Maybe that's true. And you can actually claim it's yours after 10 years. That can't be. Misakni Rabbanon Milsa, right? Would the Rabbanon institute something, the Osi Bola de Peseda, which is going to lead to a loss? This Mashkanta de Surah, yeah, was a rabbinic arrangement, and it was designed in such a way that it's not interest, it's not ribbis. It was designed to help basically encourage people to lend money, I think. Yeah, you understand? I'm worried to lend Jeremy money because I don't know if he's going to repay me. So therefore, the Chachomim institute this mashkanta d'sura arrangement, which basically means that I take over the land, and it looks a bit like interest, but it's not interest. Because really, what it's doing is it's repaying the loan. That's all it's doing. It's repaying the loan. I'm eating the apples and I'm getting my loan back. Yeah, so it encourages people to lend money. How can the Rabbanon institute something which is going to come to a definite loss, or very likely? Because at the end of 10 years, there's no more. I'm going to hide the document. I've been working the land for 10 years, plenty of years of chazaka, and I'm going to claim it's mine. How can that be? The Rabbanon will never institute something which will come to a loss. Must be that they weren't worried about this, because all Jeremy has to do is every 3 years stand up on a little box in the town square and say, you know that land? That's not his, it's mine. They should have objected, right? Here as well, and therefore here as well, the facility and the ability to object is sufficient. It's sufficient. It's enough of a protection for sellers to be able to object. Says the Rashbam, because we don't say this. This last one for the Mishnah, that objecting in this way is not an objection. Since right? Since the person who is muchsik in the land is consuming the fruits from the land min hadin legally, so you might think that it's therefore not a good objection. That it's not an objection. Come on, it's only you can only object by the straightforward type of objection, which is so and so is a thief. Because the Lakonos are going to say later on. That's why you might think it's not a good enough objection. Because not a very strong objection. Normally, objection is not Jeremy standing on a soapbox in the middle of the town saying, yeah, you know that piece of land over there? Well, it's really, yeah, he's there legitimately because he lent me money and I said he could use the land. And the land, whilst he's using the land is going to be here in order to, he's going to use the land in order to get repaid the loan, you know? But really, he's there legally now, you know? That's not a normal objection. Normal objection is Jeremy standing on a soapbox in the middle of the town saying, that guy's a thief, and it's not his land, it's mine. So that's why you might think that it's not a good enough objection. And the chiddush is of this sugya, that this Gemora, that it is that objections can work this way as well, and therefore because objections can work this way as well, it's a good enough protection for sellers. So basically, what we've done is Nahardor suggested, as recap. Okay, we're going to finish. The Zoom is going to. My phone is out of battery, so for those on Zoom, we will. We're wrapping up now anyway. So basically, what the Gemora is saying, the Nahardoi says that if you sell a palm tree to someone else, you acquire it from the top to the bottom, the whole way down. Rava says, how can that be? Because he can always say, the seller can say, at the end of the day, all you're doing is selling the tree, right? You're just selling